Have you noticed that our judicial system has been blown up right in front of your face? That our legal system isn't really even a legal system anymore? Have you noticed that the Bill of Rights, well, they're being shredded right in front of your face? Have you noticed that we have judges who aren't judges? They're political hacks in black robes. Have you noticed that all kinds of turmoil and tumult are taking place in courtrooms right before a federal election? Who's doing this? Well, let's see. We have a Democrat judge and prosecutor in Manhattan. We had a Democrat judge and prosecutor in the Albany case. We have a Democrat prosecutor in Atlanta. We have a Democrat prosecutor in the two federal cases with a Democrat judge in Washington, D.C., a real judge, thankfully, in Florida. We've had Democrat appellate judges, two of whom appointed by Biden, who've made these outrageous decisions. And now we have a Supreme Court that's having to deal with some of it. I want you to think about this for a minute. Sometimes it pays to step back. We get a lot of repetition from our legal analyst friends, many of whom say the same thing because they're correct, whether it's Stormy Daniels or Judge Merchan or whatever it is, because to anybody who has spent at least 15 minutes in law school, what's going on is a Stalinist show trial. But I don't want to get into the repetition business. I want to step back and look at this at a more comprehensive and fulsome way, that what's being done to our judicial system, our legal system, and our courts, the throwing out effectively of judicial ethics, prosecutorial ethics, legal ethics. Who's doing it? Joe Biden's doing it. Who else is doing it? The Democrat Party, federal and state, are doing it. And political judges, some of whom were elected, some of whom are radicals who've been appointed. Our judicial system is in flames, much like everything else that Joe Biden and the Democrat Party touch. No, it's not Donald Trump's fault. No, Donald Trump didn't commit these 91 offenses. No, this isn't because Donald Trump is a dictator or Hitler and they need to keep him in the box. This is a power grab by an autocratic party that sees its opportunity to clear the playing field, to win an election with a candidate who is effectively unelectable. That is exactly what's taking place. We have these so-called courts. These are Potemkin courts. These are pretend courts with pretend judges, pretend prosecutors, pretend juries, pretend laws that are being used, magnified and amplified by a state-supporting media filled with Democrats, Marxists, and Islamists. You have an unconstitutionally appointed rogue prosecutor in Jack Smith, who's been a rogue prosecutor his entire life, whether it's taking on a governor in Virginia and destroying his career unconstitutionally, whether it's taking on a Democrat candidate, that would be John Edwards, destroying him and his career, although Edwards contributed to that. And we can go on and on and on, and I shall. So questions are being raised. Can you indict a sitting president? Does presidential immunity follow a former president for his official acts or acts at all when he leaves office? Can a president pardon himself? Can a president pardon himself from state charges? Does the Espionage Act even apply to a president or a former president with regard to the retention of documents? Do non-federal prosecutors and non-federal judges have jurisdiction over federal matters like federal campaign laws if they can find a way to link it to some supposed state law? We have this unconstitutional appointment, as I said, of this prosecutor who has raised many of these issues, who's caused much of the tumult in this country. He doesn't care about the Constitution. He doesn't care about traditions. He doesn't care about the Bill of Rights. He's a hunter. He comes out of the Hague. He doesn't care. And his target is Donald Trump and everybody and anybody around him. And he's run roughshod over these courts, some of which have been happy to be, his basic partners. And he's pushed issues to the Supreme Court of the United States that should never have had to go on there. Attorney-client privilege, doesn't that apply to Donald Trump? Apparently not. First Amendment, free speech issues, doesn't that apply to Donald Trump? Well, I don't know. Gag orders in federal court, gag orders in state courts, what are they afraid of? What are they afraid of? He's a presidential candidate. He's a former president. He has at least the rights of an average defendant, but more so because the American people have a right to hear from him. The criminalization of the election process by the feds, by Merrick Garland, the only person who is less available to the press than Joe Biden is Merrick Garland, because he operates in the shadows and under the radar too, although he is the invisible hand. He's this Svengali. The criminalization of the election process. Oh, a second slate of electors, fake electors. It happened in 1876. Nobody was charged. Oh, you're contacting state representatives and boards of elections and governors and lieutenant governors. Every party's done that since the beginning of time. There's nothing wrong with that. So the criminalization of things that have always been viewed as perfectly legitimate. You don't have to believe me. That's our history. But the goal here is what? The goal here is to get Biden elected and to destroy Donald Trump. More than that. The goal here is to empower the Democrat Party as a monopoly party, don't you ever challenge it, and to destroy effectively the ability of the Republican Party to run and win elections, particularly at the presidential level. Now, this violates every notion of judicial ethics, prosecutorial ethics, legal ethics generally, federal jurisdiction. Let's talk about this case in Manhattan. And I want to say this to perhaps the 5 Supreme Court justices who may have an open mind on this presidential immunity issue. You had Judge Kagan, Judge Jackson, Judge Sotomayor, the 3 left-wing musketeers, who all came up with these horrendous hypothetical examples. What if we allow immunity for a former president? What will happen? What if he sends off nuclear bombs? What if he uses SEAL Team 6? We don't need hypotheticals. We have a reality that's taking place right now in the United States of America, a spectacle in a Manhattan courtroom where a state judge who is conflicted, his family's conflicted, he's not over his head, he is a hack, a state-sanctioned district attorney prosecutor who is a radical leftist. We have a case where the crimes aren't known, where the witnesses are hidden, where you have witnesses testifying with collateral evidence to character assassinate the defendant. We have a judge who gags the defendant, not because the defendant's dangerous, because he doesn't want the defendant criticizing what's taking place in the courtroom. You have all kinds of activities going on in that courtroom that would make Joe Stalin very, very proud. It is a disgusting abuse of power. It is a disgrace that is destroying our judicial system, unless at some point, some court steps in and stops it. We'll see. But let's take a look at this. You have a federal matter, a campaign matter, that is being used to resuscitate a state law where the statute of limitations has run, where even if it's violated, it's a misdemeanor involving a bookkeeping issue. Now, you've heard every legal analyst in the world tell you that, but here's what you haven't heard. This is a document that was agreed to by the Federal Election Commission and the Department of Justice, a memorandum of understanding on April 19, 2023, in the FEC's official records. The Commission approved a memorandum of understanding between the Federal Election Commission and the United States Department of Justice to promote the enforcement of the federal campaign finance laws. The MOU establishes guidelines for the Commission and DOJ to engage in parallel proceedings, share information in appropriate circumstances, and otherwise properly advance the missions of both agencies, subject to all relevant legal and ethical constraints, informed by the mutual respect of the independence of each agency. And it goes on. The Department of Justice has exclusive jurisdiction on criminal enforcement of the federal campaign finance laws, including related criminal offenses. There it is. Judge Merchan, you might want to copy this, but on the other hand, you might not, given who you are and what you're doing. This basically is an agreement on what we already knew, that this is federal jurisdiction. It's called federal campaign laws. And no state prosecutor and no state judge is free to just pretend that they know if a federal law was violated and then use that to burp up ridiculous indictments based on a state law that has already run the statute of limitations. Now, prior to that, on March 31, 2021, I have in my hands a letter that was sent to the Trump Organization. Dear Sir and Madam, on January 30, 2018, February 21, 2018, March 14, 2018, the Federal Election Commission notified you of complaints alleging the Trump Organization, LLC, violated certain sections of the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971, as amended, and the Commission's regulations. The Commission has considered the allegations raised in the complaints, and there were an insufficient number of votes to find reason to believe Trump Organization may have violated the Act and Commission regulations as alleged. Accordingly, the Commission closed its file in this matter on March 23, 2021. Donald Trump also received a copy of that. Left-wing groups, Common Cause and others, tried to criminalize the non-disclosure agreement, and they failed. Now, what about the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York? You've heard about this, but nobody's actually explained it to you. We actually go to the New York Times, and this is from March 31, 2023, a year ago. It is known Mr. Trump was under scrutiny from federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York some years ago as part of an investigation that also looked at his longtime fixer, Michael D. Cohen. Mr. Cohen eventually went to prison, but Mr. Trump was not charged at the time or after he left office. The prosecutors in the Justice Department have never said publicly why Mr. Trump was not charged, but some of the reasons appear to concern how the prosecutors viewed Mr. Cohen, who's expected to be involved in the case brought by the District Attorney Alvin Bragg. Involved, that's their key witness, a felon who committed crimes of perjury and fraud that goes to the heart of his character. And yet he is the key witness in a case that isn't even a case where the state law had already passed, where the federal law has passed, where there is no basis for anything taking place in this courtroom. Politico. This is from March 20 of this year. A federal judge suggested Wednesday that Michael Cohen committed perjury under oath. This is last month, giving fresh support to former President Donald Trump's claim that his one-time personal lawyer, poised to be a star prosecution witness in his upcoming New York criminal trial, is an untrustworthy liar. Judge Jesse M. Furman in Manhattan, a federal judge, questioned Cohen's truthfulness in a written order, denying his request for early release from the court supervision that followed his 3-year prison sentence for crimes including tax evasion, lying to banks and Congress, and violating campaign finance laws. This is their key witness. Furman called Cohen's testimony at Trump's civil trial in a Manhattan state court last October. On the witness stand, Cohen insisted he wasn't actually guilty of tax evasion, even though he pleaded guilty to the charge in 2018. Asked if he had lied to the federal judge who accepted his guilty plea, Cohen said yes. Cohen repeatedly and unambiguously testified at the state court trial that he was not guilty of tax evasion and that he had lied under oath. Basically, he said this guy lies his ass off for 1,000 different reasons. Why hasn't the federal government stepped in? I've asked this question for months. Going into this courtroom or into a federal courtroom, going somewhere and shut this case down. For lack of jurisdiction, for federalism reasons, for interfering in a federal election. Why haven't they done that? I want to remind those justices on the Supreme Court, especially those 5, whomever they may be. You had a lawyer argue in front of you that there was no reason for presidential immunity. You had 3 justices who made fools of themselves, going on to find as many bizarre and extreme examples of what might happen if President Trump wins the day in the Supreme Court on the immunity issue. Again, you don't need hypotheticals. You just look at what's happening in Manhattan right now. This is what's going to go on throughout the country, without limit, without boundaries. The interference in presidential elections, state prosecutors coming up with concoctions to use federal law, way out of their jurisdiction, a Department of Justice that refuses to defend federal jurisdiction while it's in your court demanding that there be no post-presidential immunity. We have 5 former attorneys general, 1 existing. Partisan politics must play no role in decisions of federal investigators or prosecutors regarding any investigation of criminal crimes. Jack Smith, this is all he cares about. He came to your court, the Supreme Court, and he demanded that you rule immediately and get this trial underway. All of these have been timed to do exactly that. Well, they say, the Inspector General, the Department of Justice said, this is just advisory. That's right, attorneys general issue these memos just because they're giving advice. But it's more than advisory. We go to the Department of Justice Handbook, 9-85-500, actions that may have an impact on an election. This is not just advisory. These are the rules. Federal prosecutors and agents may never select the timing of any action, including investigative steps, criminal charges, or statements, for the purpose of affecting any election or for the purpose of giving an advantage or disadvantage to any candidate or political party. This is a rule, Mr. Inspector General. Such a purpose is inconsistent with the department's mission and with the principles of federal prosecution. See Section 9-27.260. Any action likely to raise an issue or perception of an issue under this provision requires consultation with the Public Integrity Section, and such action shall not be taken if the Public Integrity Section advises that further consultation is required with the Deputy Attorney General or the Attorney General. So they go through the back door to the Biden regime with local prosecutors. They've allowed collateral evidence. As I was the first to mention on this network, all this evidence with Stormy Daniels and the rest of the reprobates obviously is intended to damage Trump's due process right. It's not probative. The right to know the specific crimes you're actually being charged with, that is a simple due process issue under federal and state constitutional law. The right to know who your witnesses are so you can prepare for them. These witnesses have been hidden by this judge. The right to First Amendment free speech, gag orders. Gag orders are issued to protect the defendant from the government, not protect the government from criticism from the defendant. You have prosecution brought in retaliation for the political expression or the fact that this man, Donald Trump, is running for president. That is a clear violation of the First Amendment. So my point is this. Supreme Court, pay attention to what's taking place. This jury, if it convicts, the goal here is to get the scarlet letter, but it's more than that. Eric Holder said publicly that if Donald Trump is found guilty of any charge in any court, and he still wins election to the presidency, that there should be immediate move by the Democrats to impeach him under the 14th Amendment. This will never end unless it's put to death right now.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.